He spent his last $50 on a boat no one believed could float, and before dawn, his old Doberman was barking at something hidden beneath the floor. The harbor of Port Mason, Nova Scotia, wore winter like an old coat, salt-stiff, faded, and heavy at the seams. Wind moved through the empty slips with a low whistle, pushing thin sheets of sleet across the weathered docks. The fishing season had failed again. Too few cod, too many closures, too many families staring at bills they could not outrun. Storefront lights along Water Street went dark earlier every month now. Some never came back on. Nathan Mercer stood at the end of Pier 7 with his duffel bag in one hand and a leash in the other. He was 42, broad-shouldered once, lean now in the way hardship makes a man lean. His navy pea coat had seen better winters. So had the boots on his feet. The brim of his wool cap shadowed tired blue eyes that still scanned every corner the way trained eyes do. For 15 years he had worn a badge. Then one report refused, one signature denied, and a department that praised honesty in speeches forgot its meaning in practice. He lost the job first, then the apartment, then the habit of expecting fairness. Beside him stood Bruno, a 12-year-old Doberman with a graying muzzle and the patient posture of a veteran who no longer needed to prove anything. His black and rust coat had thinned along the ribs, but his chest still carried dignity. One ear bent slightly from some old injury Nathan never knew the story of. Bruno had come from a retired K9 handler years ago, unwanted because of age, cherished because of soul. The dog watched the harbor in silence while gulls circled overhead, crying like unpaid debts. "Well, partner," Nathan murmured, rubbing the side of Bruno's neck. "Home sweet home." The boat tied to the cleat before them looked less like a home and more like a warning. Her hull was scarred cedar, paint peeled to the grain, name half faded across the stern, Mercy Tide. A 26-foot wreck with cracked windows, loose railings, and a smell of damp rope, diesel, and forgotten years. The owner, an old mechanic named Donnelly, had taken Nathan's $50 with the kind of shrug men use when selling regret. "If she sinks," Donnelly had said, "she'll do it." Politely. Nathan climbed aboard carefully. The deck groaned under his weight. Bruno followed slower, nails ticking against the planks. Inside the cabin, a narrow bunk leaned crooked against the wall. A rusted kettle sat in a sink stained orange by time. Frost traced the inside corners of the windows like pale branches. It was cold enough to see breath. Yet it was shelter. It was a door that locked. It was more than he had yesterday. Nathan set down the duffel and unpacked his kingdom: 2 wool blankets, a flashlight, 3 tins of soup, dry kibble, a thermos, 1 framed photograph turned face down, and a folded letter he never opened anymore. Bruno inspected each corner, then settled near the small propane heater as if assigning himself guard duty. Outside, harbor bells rang somewhere in the mist. Nathan boiled water, poured tea into a chipped mug, and listened to the boat answer the tide with soft creaks. He thought of all the places a man could end up after doing the right thing, and how often they were smaller than expected. "Could be worse," he said. Bruno opened one eye, unconvinced. Night deepened. Snow began in fine grains, tapping the roof of the cabin. Nathan wrapped himself in blankets on the bunk while Bruno lay on the floor below. The heater hissed. Wind pressed against the hull. Somewhere along the pier, chains clinked in the dark. Sleep came in broken pieces. Then at exactly 2:17 a.m., Bruno stood. Nathan heard the low rumble first, deep in the dog's chest. Then came the sound of claws striking wood. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. Slow, deliberate, steady as code. Nathan lifted his head. "Bruno." The dog ignored him. He moved to the center of the cabin floor and scratched again at one narrow strip of planking between the table and the bunk. Tap. Tap tap. Then a bark, short, sharp, certain. Not fear. Not confusion. Discovery. Nathan grabbed the flashlight and swung the beam downward. The boards looked older there, darker than the rest, edges uneven, nails newer than they should have been. Bruno stepped back and stared at the spot, eyes bright in the pale light. Snow whispered against the glass. The harbor held its breath. Nathan knelt slowly, palm resting on the cold wood, and felt something hollow answer from below. Nathan pressed his ear to the plank and heard it again, a faint emptiness beneath the wood, different from the heavy solid sound of the rest of the cabin floor. Bruno stood beside him without moving, muscles still, eyes fixed on the spot as if guarding a confession. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Nathan's hand, not from fear but from the cold that had crept into his fingers. Outside, the harbor wind slid along the hull with a low moan. Inside, the little cabin felt suddenly smaller, charged with the quiet tension of something waiting years to be found. "All right," he whispered. "You win." He reached into his duffel and pulled out the folding knife he used for rope and cans. The blade slipped beneath the edge of the board. Old wood resisted first, then sighed. One nail lifted with a soft squeal. Another followed. Dust rose in a narrow light, carrying the smell of mildew, cedar, and trapped seasons. Bruno leaned closer, nostrils flaring. Nathan worked slowly, careful not to crack what little floor the boat had left. After several minutes the plank gave way enough to lift. He set it aside and aimed the light downward. A shallow compartment lay beneath, no more than 60 centimeters deep, lined with tar paper gone brittle with age. Inside sat a rectangular tin box wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord darkened by time. There was no treasure shine, no movie magic, only something humble and deliberate, hidden by hands that expected trouble. Nathan stared at it for a long moment. Men hide many things. Money. Shame. Hope. He reached down and lifted the bundle free. It was heavier than it looked. Bruno let out one soft breath through his nose, almost satisfied. "You knew," Nathan said. "Did you smell it through the boards all this time?" The dog blinked slowly, keeping his secrets. Nathan sat at the little table and untied the cord. The oilcloth cracked where it folded. Beneath it, the tin was stamped with the faded logo of a bait company that had closed decades ago. Rust sealed the lid around the edges. He pried it open with the knife. Inside were 3 items wrapped separately in wax paper, a leather-bound notebook swollen from damp, a brass key attached to a cork float, and a rolled chart secured by elastic that snapped the moment he touched it. Nathan unfolded the chart first. It was a marine map of the bay and outer islands, yellowed and marked by hand in red pencil. One small island northeast of the harbor had been circled twice. Beside it were coordinates and a note in block letters, "Low tide only." Nathan knew the place by sight if not by name. Gull Rock. Barely more than stone and scrub spruce, reachable safely only when the sea allowed it. He opened the notebook next. The first page carried a name written carefully in blue ink. Elias Boone. Underneath it, a date from 12 years earlier. Nathan turned pages slowly. Entries spoke of catches growing smaller, water smelling wrong, dead shellfish washing ashore in clusters no one wanted to discuss. Then the tone changed. Boats following him at night. Men asking questions on the dock. A warning left under his windshield wiper. Nathan read in silence while Bruno settled at his feet. The heater hissed. Snow ticked against the window. On the final written page, the pen strokes looked hurried, pressed deep into the paper. "If anything happens to me, do not trust the company. Samples are real. Copies are safe where gulls cannot keep secrets. Tell Port Mason I did not run." Nathan lowered the book. The cabin felt colder than before. He remembered the faces downtown, shops shuttered, men pretending not to count coins at the till, women taking second jobs after seasons that never paid enough. He remembered hearing the name Boone once in a diner conversation years ago. Fishermen vanished offshore. Sad story. No body found. Eventually the town moved on because towns must. Nathan looked at the brass key in his palm. It was warm now from his skin. "You hear that, Bruno?" he said softly. "Either we found an old man's grief, or somebody buried the truth." Bruno lifted his head at the last word. Then he walked to the door and stood there, waiting. Nathan glanced toward the black window where dawn was still hours away. Beyond it lay sleet, tide charts, and an island of stone. He slipped the notebook into his coat, folded the map, and closed his hand around the key. Some nights change a man quietly. This one began with claws on wood and ended with purpose breathing again. By first light the storm had thinned to a pale mist drifting low across Port Mason harbor. The world looked washed clean but not healed. Nathan stood on the deck with a mug of tea warming his hands while Bruno watched gulls wheel over the water. The old Doberman seemed younger this morning, ears lifted, chest forward, purpose lending strength where age had stolen some. Men often mistake years for weakness. Dogs rarely do. Nathan studied the marine chart again. Gull Rock sat just under 5 nautical miles northeast of the harbor mouth, beyond the channel markers and past a shoal known for chewing careless hulls. In summer it was a nuisance. In winter it could be a lesson. Beside the coordinates Elias Boone had written one more note Nathan had missed in the dark, 1 hour after lowest tide. He checked the tide table posted near the fuel shack. Lowest tide would come at 10:42 a.m. That gave him less than 4 hours to ready a boat that should have been retired with dignity years ago. He set to work without wasting motion. Old habits from old jobs. He tightened loose lines, checked the bilge pump twice, patched a window seam with marine tape bought on credit from a sleepy clerk, and topped the fuel tank with just enough diesel to gamble responsibly. The harbor master, a barrel-chested man named Colin Fraser, watched from the dock while pretending not to. "You planning to cross the Atlantic in that coffin?" Colin called. Nathan kept coiling rope. "Just taking her for air." Colin spat into the water and shook his head. "Mercy tide has not left this slip in 3 years. Last fellow who tried got towed back by teenagers in a skiff." Nathan smiled faintly. "Then I will aim higher than their expectations." Colin snorted despite himself. Bruno stepped to the rail and stared at the man until he laughed. "Dog has better judgment than you." "Usually," Nathan said. By 9:30 the engine coughed awake in a cloud of blue complaint. The sound turned a few heads along the pier. Doors opened. Curtains twitched. Small towns are built from timber, weather, and curiosity. Nathan eased the throttle forward. Mercy tide shuddered, then moved. Slow at first, like an old boxer remembering footwork. Bruno braced near the bow, paws wide, nose to the wind. As they cleared the breakwater, open water met them with a harder rhythm. Swells rolled in long gray shoulders from the Atlantic, lifting the boat and setting it down with blunt honesty. The patched cabin rattled. A cupboard door swung loose and banged once per wave until Nathan tied it shut with twine. Salt spray froze in thin crystals along the rail. He kept one gloved hand on the wheel and the other near the chart. Behind them, Port Mason shrank into church steeple, warehouses, and smoke threads rising from chimneys. Ahead lay mist and stone. Nathan had spent years reading faces, rooms, and lies. Seas were simpler. They only asked whether you were prepared. Halfway out, the engine sputtered once. Then again. Nathan listened closely, adjusted the choke, whispered something impolite, and the motor steadied. Bruno turned to look back at him as if evaluating command decisions. "You are not helping morale," Nathan said. The dog blinked into the wind. At 10:31 a.m., Gull Rock emerged from the fog like the back of some sleeping animal. Low spruce clung to one side. The rest was granite scarred white by gull droppings and winter. No dock. No shelter. Just a narrow inlet where calmer water lapped against stone. Nathan circled once, found a place to anchor in 3 meters of water, and cut the engine. Silence arrived so suddenly it felt sacred. Only gull cries and the ticking of cooling metal remained. He checked his watch. 11 minutes to low tide. They waited. The sea began to draw itself back inch by inch, exposing black weed-slick ledges and a narrow path of stone leading toward the island center. Bruno whined softly, not anxious, impatient. "I know," Nathan said. "Me too." When the watch struck 10:42, he clipped the brass key inside his coat pocket, took a shovel from the cabin floor, and stepped into ankle-deep water cold enough to sting through rubber boots. Bruno leapt beside him with more grace than a dog his age had any right to own. Together they crossed the glistening rocks toward the scrub pines above, where something buried had been waiting longer than grief. The rocks of Gull Rock shone black and slick beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Nathan moved carefully, planting each boot with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing creates expensive memories. Bruno ranged a few steps ahead, nose low, tail steady, then paused often to make sure Nathan followed. Wind bent the scrub spruce inland and carried the sharp scent of salt, kelp, and distant snow. Somewhere above, gulls argued over nothing important. The chart had shown a mark near the island center, but maps drawn by hand speak in suggestions, not guarantees. Nathan climbed a narrow rise of granite and looked over the crown of the island. It was smaller than it had seemed from the water, perhaps 100 meters across, with twisted brush in the middle and shelves of stone falling to the sea on every side. No shack. No pier. No obvious place for secrets. Either Elias liked puzzles, Nathan muttered, or I do not read his handwriting. Bruno ignored the remark and moved toward a cluster of wind-stunted pines rooted in a patch of stubborn soil. There he began to circle, sniffing the ground in widening loops. Nathan watched the dog's body language sharpen. This was not random curiosity. It was recognition of scent layered beneath years of rain and frost. Bruno stopped beside a flat stone half buried in moss and tapped it once with a paw. Then again. Nathan knelt and brushed away the moss with gloved fingers. Carved into the rock were 2 initials nearly erased by weather. E.B. Hope can survive in smaller marks than men imagine. He set the shovel blade under the stone and levered upward. At first nothing moved. Then the earth released it with a sucking sound. Beneath lay a shallow cavity lined with broken slate. Inside rested a small steel lockbox, its corners orange with rust, a brass keyhole still intact. Nathan exhaled slowly. Some discoveries make noise. Others silence a man. Bruno sat beside him, chest lifted as if he had expected nothing less. Good work, partner. He reached into his coat and removed the brass key attached to the cork float. It fit perfectly. The lock resisted, then turned with a dry click that seemed loud enough to wake the whole bay. Nathan lifted the lid. No gold glimmered. No stacks of cash waited to rescue fortunes. Instead there were sealed plastic pouches, labeled sample jars, a stack of ledgers wrapped in wax paper, and 3 videotapes marked with dates from 12 years ago. On top lay a typed letter folded in thirds. Nathan opened it carefully. If you are reading this, the water told the truth before men did. I sent copies to authorities. No answer. If I disappear, it means they chose money over fishermen. Give this to someone who still fears God or respects evidence. Elias Boone. Nathan read it twice. The wind seemed sharper now. He opened one pouch and found laboratory reports listing contamination levels in shellfish beds near Port Mason. Mercury. Solvents. Heavy discharge far above legal limits. Another envelope held invoices tied to North Bay Processing, the largest employer in the region until it closed 2 years earlier and blamed market conditions. There were payment records to consultants, transport firms, and names Nathan recognized from old council signs downtown. He felt that old sensation from police work returning, the quiet click when scattered facts align into a shape no one wanted seen. Port Mason had not simply suffered bad seasons. It had been poisoned, then lied to, then abandoned. Bruno stood and faced the shoreline, ears high. Nathan looked up. The tide was already turning. Water slid back over the rocks below, erasing the path they had crossed. Time, like truth, rarely waits long. He repacked everything fast but carefully, placing the letter inside his coat. The lockbox was heavier now that he understood it. Burdens often are. As they descended toward the inlet, a distant engine carried across the bay. Nathan froze and listened. Not the cough of an old fishing skiff. Smoother. Newer. A larger motor approaching through the mist. Bruno gave one low growl from deep in his chest. Nathan glanced at the narrowing strip of exposed stone between island and anchored boat. Whoever was coming had chosen a lonely place to arrive. Nathan moved fast, not panicked. Panic wastes oxygen and judgment. He slid the ledgers and sample pouches into his duffel, tucked the videotapes beneath his coat, then handed the empty lockbox to the sea of brush where it vanished under scrub and stone. Bruno remained still beside him, eyes fixed on the fog bank where the engine sound grew louder with each passing second. The tide now covered half the rock path to the inlet. Thin sheets of water raced over the granite, turning every step into polished glass. Boat first, Nathan said quietly. Questions later. They descended together, Nathan carrying the shovel in one hand and the duffel in the other. The island seemed steeper now, urgency changing the shape of things. At the shoreline, Mercy tide tugged against her anchor line, rising and dipping with the incoming water. Beyond her, a white cabin cruiser materialized through the mist, 30 feet. At least, twin outboards humming with expensive confidence. No fishing gear. Dark windows. Clean hull. It slowed as it approached the far side of Gull Rock. Nathan knew that kind of arrival. People with honest business do not hide in weather. He stepped into knee-deep water, biting cold rushing through his boots, and waded to Mercy tide. Bruno leapt aboard with surprising grace for an old dog. Nathan climbed after him, hauled the duffel into the cockpit, and reached for the anchor rope. The cruiser rounded the stone point 50 meters away. Two men stood near the bow in matching black jackets. One lifted a hand, not friendly, not hostile, simply claiming attention. "Morning," he called across the water. His voice carried the polished ease of someone used to being obeyed. "Trouble out here?" Nathan kept pulling rope hand over hand. "Only the usual kind." The man smiled faintly. "We saw your vessel from the channel. Thought we should check if you needed assistance." Nathan glanced at the immaculate deck, chrome rails, radar dome, the kind of help that sends invoices later. "Kind of you." Bruno stood at Nathan's side, silent but rigid, eyes locked on the stranger. The second man noticed the dog and took one cautious step back. Animals often read intentions faster than people. "You were on the island?" the first man asked. "Briefly." "Find anything interesting?" Nathan fed the wet rope into the locker. "Seaweed. Rocks. A few gulls with opinions." The smile faded by a degree. "That island belongs to North Bay Holdings." "Funny," Nathan said. "It did not mention that on the rocks." For a moment only engines spoke. Then the man's tone softened into something colder than anger. "There are liability issues with old industrial sites. Dangerous debris. If you picked up any abandoned property, company policy requires it be surrendered." Nathan started Mercy Tide's engine. It coughed, spat smoke, then caught. The old boat shook like an offended horse. "My policy," Nathan replied, "is not taking instructions from strangers." He eased the throttle forward. Mercy Tide lurched away from the shallows just as a swell rolled between the boats. The cruiser swung to block the open channel. Nathan cut hard starboard, steering toward a narrow cut between two reef markers half submerged by tide. Colin Fraser had mentioned it once in harbour gossip, Widow's Gate. Safe only for boats small enough or foolish enough. The cruiser hesitated. Too deep a draft. Too much paint to scratch. Nathan needed only one chance. Spray hit his face like needles as Mercy Tide bounced through the chop. Bruno braced wide-legged, never losing balance. Behind them the larger boat circled wide, searching another angle. Nathan threaded the old hull between dark rocks where water boiled white on either side. One wrong meter would splinter cedar and story alike. "Come on, girl," he whispered to the boat. "One more good decision." Mercy Tide answered with a groan but held course. They burst through the cut into broader water beyond. The cruiser, forced to detour, lost precious minutes. Port Mason appeared in the distance beneath lifting fog, church steeple faint against the shoreline. Nathan exhaled for what felt like the first time since the island. He looked at Bruno, whose ears were still pinned toward the pursuit behind them. "I know," Nathan said. "They know we have it." He touched the hidden videotapes beneath his coat. "Some truths sleep quietly for years. The moment they wake, someone always tries to put them back down." Mercy Tide limped back into Port Mason just after noon, trailing smoke and dignity in equal measure. The harbor was busier now, though busy in towns like this meant 3 men mending traps, a teenager hauling ice, and 2 retirees arguing beside a bait freezer as if Parliament had asked for their guidance. Nathan guided the boat into slip 7 and cut the engine. Silence fell with the gentle slap of water against the hull. Bruno was first to move. He stepped onto the dock, then turned back to wait, as if no mission counted complete until both of them were ashore. Nathan lifted the duffel carefully. It seemed heavier than before, though paper weighs little. Meaning is what adds pounds. Colin Fraser appeared from the fuel shed carrying a wrench he did not need. "You were chased," he said. Nathan looked at him. "Was I?" Colin nodded toward the channel where the white cruiser slowed outside the breakwater, then turned away without entering. "That boat asked if I had seen a damaged cedar vessel with engine trouble. I said half the harbor matches that description." Nathan almost smiled. "You always this helpful." "Only when expensive men ask rude questions." Colin's eyes dropped to the duffel. "You find something?" Nathan considered the years he had spent deciding whom to trust. Uniforms helped once. Titles helped less than people believed. In the end, character was usually visible in small moments. A man who lies to powerful strangers for no profit was worth noticing. "Maybe," Nathan said. "Need a place quiet and dry." Colin jerked his head toward the old net loft above the storage sheds. "Key is under the blue bucket. Heat works if you insult it first." 30 minutes later Nathan stood inside the loft with Bruno at his side. The room smelled of rope fiber, dust, and cedar planks warmed by an electric heater older than common sense. Sunlight pushed through high windows in pale bars. Nathan spread the contents of the duffel across a scarred worktable, ledgers, reports, videotapes, the notebook of Elias Boone. He photographed every page with his phone, then uploaded copies whenever the weak signal allowed. One file failed twice before sending. He tried again. Never trust a single copy of anything important. Bruno lay by the heater but did not sleep. Each time footsteps sounded below, one eye opened. Nathan inserted the first videotape into an ancient player Colin found somewhere in the building. Static rolled, then steadied. Grainy footage appeared on a small television. Nighttime. Water reflecting floodlights. A discharge pipe extending from a North Bay processing dock into dark tidewater. Thick liquid poured from it in pulses. Then Elias Boone's voice, wind-blown but clear enough. December 14th. They only dump after midnight now. The image shook as if he were hiding while filming. A truck backed to the pier. Men moved barrels without labels. One face turned briefly toward camera. Nathan paused the frame. He knew that face. Counselor Martin Hale, once champion of harbor jobs, now owner of 3 rental properties and a smile too polished for January. Nathan sat back slowly. Corruption rarely invents new masks. It reuses familiar ones. The second tape showed dead lobster washed into reeds. The third captured 2 men confronting Elias on a dock, voices sharp but indistinct, then the camera dropping sideways. The footage ended there. Nathan stared at the black screen after it clicked silent. Bruno rose and placed his chin gently on Nathan's knee. "Yeah," Nathan said softly. He knew. He opened the ledger next. Payment columns, dates, shell companies, initials tied to transfers. Enough to suggest pattern. Enough to invite lawyers. Enough to anger people who prefer. Darkness. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered without speaking. A man's calm voice replied. "Mr. Mercer, returning property that does not belong to you would be wise." Nathan looked through the loft window at the harbor below, where ordinary people loaded bait, swept sidewalks, lived honest Tuesdays. "Then send the rightful owners," he said, and ended the call. He dialed the one person in town whose reputation had survived bankruptcy untouched, Mira Chen, solicitor, daughter of a fisherman, known for charging fairly and remembering insults forever. She answered on the second ring. "If this is about unpaid mortgage, I am busy. It is about why half this town went broke." Silence held for one breath. Then her voice changed. "Where are you?" Nathan glanced at Bruno, who had returned to the window and begun a low growl toward the street below. A black SUV had just parked across from the sheds. "At the loft," Nathan said. "And I think we should move quickly." Mira Chen arrived in 12 minutes, which in Port Mason counted as urgency. Nathan heard her boots on the loft stairs before the door opened. She entered carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of expression lawyers wear when they suspect nonsense but hope for billable miracles. She was in her late 30s, compact, sharp-eyed, dark hair pinned back against the wind, navy coat buttoned to the throat. Her father had fished these waters for 30 years before the catches died and the mortgage with them. She glanced once at Nathan, once at the papers spread across the table, then at Bruno standing between her and the room like a bouncer with manners. "If he bites me," she said, "I am charging extra." "He only bites character flaws," Nathan replied. Bruno stepped aside. Mira set down her briefcase and began reading. Nathan said nothing. Good evidence improves in silence. The heater clicked and hummed. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor. Inside, pages turned. After 10 minutes Mira removed her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and watched the frozen frame of the videotape where waste poured into black water. "Where did you get this?" "A dead fisherman's insurance policy." "Do more people know you have it?" "At least 2 men in a black sport utility vehicle." She crossed to the window carefully and peered through a gap in the blinds. The vehicle remained across the street, engine idling. 2 silhouettes inside. Waiting has always been the cheapest form of pressure. "Listen carefully," Mira said. "This is not gossip, not a town rumor, not social media nonsense. This is chain of custody evidence tied to environmental fraud, bribery, and wrongful economic loss. If authentic, it can reopen civil claims and trigger criminal review." Nathan leaned against the table. "You say that like good news. I say it like dangerous news." She took out her phone and photographed everything with methodical precision. Then she called someone named Justice Havelock in Halifax and spoke in legal shorthand fast enough to sound like weather. When she ended the call, her jaw was tighter. "Provincial investigators can be here tomorrow if the roads hold." "Tomorrow is generous." Mira nodded toward the street. "Then we survive today." Nathan looked again through the blinds. One of the men had stepped from the SUV. Tall, black jacket, hands in pockets, studying the sheds with patient boredom. Not threatening. Worse. Professional. Bruno's low growl vibrated through the floorboards. Backstairs? Nathan asked. Too visible, Mira said. Front door. Too foolish. She scanned the loft, eyes settling on a freight hatch in the floor once used for lifting nets. How much do you trust the harbor? Nathan almost smiled. More than I trust corporations. 5 minutes later Colin Fraser answered Myra's call with 3 words unsuitable for church, then agreed immediately. The old harbormaster arrived driving a forklift that had survived several governments. He parked beneath the loft hatch while pretending this was routine commerce. Nathan packed the originals into waterproof totes. Copies remained uploading to cloud storage whenever signal blinked alive. Mira slid one tote to him and kept the other. If we separate, they cannot stop both. That assumes they are polite. I have litigated against developers for 15 years, she said. Politeness is not my working model. They opened the hatch. Cold air rushed up smelling of diesel and tidewater. Colin raised the forks until level with the floor. You two coming or sending luggage, he called. Nathan lowered Mira first, then the evidence, then climbed down himself. Bruno did not wait for assistance. The old Doberman leapt cleanly to the pallet and landed with more grace than men half his age. Even Colin blinked. Dog still has springs. He has standards, Nathan said. They moved through the back lanes of the harbor, forklift. Rattling past stacks of traps and pallets of salt, hidden in plain sight among ordinary work. Across the street, the man by the SUV noticed too late. He started forward just as Colin turned a corner and blocked the lane with 2 tons of stubborn machinery. Delivery delay, Colin called cheerfully. Nathan and Mira slipped behind a fish warehouse and into her station wagon. Bruno climbed into the rear seat beside the tote. Mira started the engine. Where now? Nathan asked. She handed him a business card with an address written on the back. St. Andrew's Church Hall. Tonight the town council holds a community recovery meeting there. Councillor Hale will speak about resilience. She pulled into traffic, eyes hard on the road. I think we should let him discuss honesty as well. Bruno rested one paw on the evidence case as Port Mason rolled past the windows, unaware that by sunset, some names would weigh less and some truths far more. By evening, snow had given up and turned to cold rain that glazed the streets of Port Mason in silver reflections. St. Andrew's Church Hall glowed warm against the weather, windows bright with yellow light and silhouettes of neighbors carrying casseroles, folding chairs, and old frustrations. In small Canadian towns, meetings begin with coffee, apologies, and the suspicion that nothing will change. Nathan sat in Mira Chen's station wagon across the street with Bruno beside him in the rear seat, the old Doberman's chin resting on the evidence tote. Wipers moved steadily. Rain tapped the roof like patient fingers. Through the hall windows he could see Councillor Martin Hale shaking hands near the entrance, smiling the smile from the videotape, broader now, polished by years of surviving questions. He looks comfortable, Nathan said. Mira adjusted a stack of printed copies on her lap. Men often do right before consequences. She had spent the afternoon making duplicates, forwarding files to provincial contacts, and preparing sworn statements with the efficiency of someone who sharpens stress into tools. We do this carefully, she continued. No shouting. No accusations without documents in hand. Let him lie first if he chooses. Courts appreciate volunteers. Nathan nodded. He had once believed truth alone could carry a room. Experience taught otherwise. Truth needs timing, witnesses, and a microphone that works. Bruno lifted his head suddenly and stared toward the side lane. The black sport utility. Vehicle rolled past slowly, then parked half a block away. Headlights off. 2 men remained inside. Watching. Your audience is early, Mira said. Then let us not disappoint them. Inside, the hall smelled of brewed coffee, wet coats, floor polish, and baked bread donated by people who still solved hardship with ovens. Rows of metal chairs faced a small stage where a portable podium stood beneath a wooden cross. Around 80 townspeople had gathered, retired fishers with weathered hands, young parents carrying children, shop owners, deckhands, widows, students home from Halifax. Faces marked by lean years. Murmurs moved through the room when Nathan entered with Bruno at heel. Some recognized the former officer from headlines years ago. Others recognized only the look of a man recently acquainted with loss. Martin Hale tapped the microphone and offered the room his best concern. Friends, neighbors, tonight we discuss recovery grants, harbor revitalization, and new opportunities for Port Mason. He spoke smoothly of resilience, partnerships, future seasons, strategic planning. Words polished enough to reflect nothing. Nathan watched the crowd. Hope still leaned forward despite everything. That was the cruelest thing corruption steals, not money, but the habit of believing. Hale moved to questions. A bakery owner asked about tax relief. A young father asked about jobs. An older woman asked why the shellfish beds remained closed after so many years. Hale gave practiced answers shaped like answers but empty in the center. Mira rose from the third row. The room quieted. Everyone knew Mira Chen. Counselor Hale, she said evenly, before further discussion, would you explain your presence 12 years ago at North Bay's midnight discharge pier? The hall stilled so completely even the urn seemed to stop hissing. Hale blinked once, then smiled. I am afraid I do not understand the question. That makes one of us. Mira walked to the stage carrying a portable projector and handed Nathan a cable. He connected it to the hall screen normally used for hymn lyrics. Grainy video filled the wall, dark water, floodlights, toxic discharge pouring from a pipe, then Hale's younger face turning toward camera. Gasps moved through the chairs like wind through reeds. Someone whispered, "No." Hale stepped back from the podium. "This is fabricated." Mira held up laboratory reports. "Then these contamination tests are fabricated as well." She raised payment ledgers next. "And these transfers to shell companies tied to municipal approvals?" Voices rose now. Not chaos. Hurt. The deeper sound. Nathan climbed the stage slowly and placed Elias Boone's notebook on the podium. "A man vanished trying to tell this town the truth," he said. "He wrote your names before he disappeared." Hale's confidence thinned visibly. He reached for the notebook. Bruno was faster. The old Doberman moved one step forward and stood between the man and the podium, silent, unmoving, eyes steady as law. Hale froze. Laughter broke somewhere in the back, sharp and brief, then applause followed it. Strange how quickly fear changes sides. Mira spoke over the room. Copies of all evidence have already gone to provincial investigators and national media. This meeting is now documentation of public notice. Outside, sirens sounded faintly through the rain, not dramatic, just official. Hale looked toward the doors as if searching for exits life had closed. Nathan looked at the townspeople instead. Faces once bent by defeat were lifting, not because pain had vanished, but because it finally had a name. Bruno remained at the podium, guarding a dead fisherman's voice until the living were ready to hear it. The hall did not erupt all at once. Shock in decent towns arrives in layers. First came silence, the stunned kind that makes every cough sound rude. Then chairs scraped. Then voices rose in pockets as neighbors turned to neighbors, comparing years of closed shops, empty traps, sick waters, and promises now exposed as polished theft. Rain drummed harder against the church windows as if even the weather wished to be heard. Martin Hale stepped away from the podium, face pale beneath the stage lights. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, but the microphone betrayed him by carrying every tremor to the back row. Mira Chen did not move. Then you may explain it under oath. Two provincial officers entered through the side doors, coats wet, notebooks ready, not dramatic men, just patient ones. They crossed the aisle with the steady pace of people who know truth often takes years and one evening to arrive. Hale glanced toward the main entrance where the black sport utility vehicle had just gone dark. No rescue came. Power has many friends until records appear. Nathan stood near the stage stairs while Bruno remained planted beside the podium, old muzzle lifted, body still as carved oak. A young boy in the front row whispered to his mother. "The dog is guarding the truth." She squeezed his hand and nodded without taking her eyes from the stage. The officers asked Hale to step aside for questions. He protested, then softened, then complied, cycling through the usual seasons of a trapped man. Around the room, people were no longer looking at him. They were looking at each other, doing painful arithmetic with memory. Mrs. Donnelly, whose bait shop had closed 6 winters ago, began to cry quietly. A retired captain named Seamus Kerr stared at the floor and said to no one, "I sold my boat for less than the motor was worth." A nurse from the clinic whispered that her brother had moved west for work and never came home. Injury often becomes visible only when named. Mira climbed the stage and addressed the room without notes. "Listen carefully. Tonight changes nothing about what you endured. But it changes what caused it. You were not failures. You were deceived. There is a difference, and in law it matters." Heads lifted at that. Nathan had seen the same look in people cleared after false accusations, grief still present, but no longer poisoned by shame. The projector screen shifted to charts and dates. Mira explained contamination reports, concealed discharges, manipulated closures, and payment trails linking shell firms to approvals. She spoke plain enough for fishermen and precise enough for judges. Every sentence laid one more plank across the water between pain and accountability. Nathan watched Bruno more than the crowd. The old Doberman had lowered himself to a sit, yet his eyes remained on the room's doors. Guarding was no longer a task for him. It was grammar. When Mira finished, questions came fast. Could claims be reopened? Could pensions be restored? Could medical reviews be requested? Could the harbor grounds be tested again? Could North Bay be made to pay? Yes, she answered carefully, to some. Perhaps to many. But not tonight. Tonight we preserve evidence and witness statements. She opened sign-up sheets on folding tables. Lines formed immediately. Some people brought documents from home. Old invoices. Letters. Photographs of dead catches. Notes written years ago because something had felt wrong. Truth loves company once invited. Nathan stepped outside for air. Rain had softened to mist. Streetlights haloed the wet pavement. Across the road, the black SUV sat empty now, doors unlocked, abandoned with the speed of cowards. Colin Fraser stood under the church awning smoking nothing, just holding an unlit cigarette for ceremony. "Town in there sounds alive," he said. "It is angry. Same thing, some nights." Colin glanced at Bruno through the doorway. "Dog started all this with a floorboard, eh?" Nathan looked toward the harbor where Mercy Tide rocked unseen in darkness. Dog only pointed. The truth was already there. Colin grunted approval. Inside, applause rose suddenly and sustained itself. Not celebration. Recognition. Nathan returned to the hall and saw why. On the projector screen was a photograph of Elias Boone from better years, standing beside a younger boat with a grin full of weather and missing teeth. Someone had found it in a wallet. The town stood for him. Even Hale, seated at the side under watch, had nowhere to look but upward. Bruno walked to the front row and rested his head in Mrs. Donnelly's lap. She wept into his ears while stroking the gray along his muzzle. Some victories are signed in courtrooms. Others begin when broken people remember they were worth defending all along. Morning came to Port Mason with a cleaner sky than the town had seen in months. Rain had washed the streets, and sunlight now touched the harbor roofs in bands of gold as if light itself were cautious but willing to return. Nathan woke in the cabin of Mercy tied to the sound of gulls and the slower breathing of Bruno asleep near the heater. For one long moment he forgot everything except the warmth of blankets and the smell of cedar dampened by salt. Then memory returned in full, the hall, the projector glow, the faces lifted toward truth. He sat up carefully. Bruno opened one eye, thumped his tail once against the floor, and went back to sleep. Even heroes keep practical hours. Outside, the dock carried a different energy. People moved with purpose instead of habit. Trucks unloaded lumber. 2 young men repaired a crab winch that had rusted untouched for years. Someone laughed near the fuel shed, a sound that had become rare enough to notice. Nathan stepped onto the deck with a mug of tea and found fresh bread wrapped in cloth tied to the rail. No note. Gratitude in small towns prefers anonymity. On the dock below, Colin Fraser was arguing cheerfully with a forklift. "Your vessel has admirers," he called up. "That usually ends badly." Nathan looked down the pier. 3 children approached carrying paint cans and brushes far too large for them. Mrs. Donnelly followed behind with a tray of muffins and the expression of a woman who had decided everyone else would cooperate. "We are not asking," she announced. "This boat looks like despair. We are fixing that first." Nathan started to object, then saw half the harbor already watching with amused expectation. Resistance would be both futile and rude. "I only own $50 of her," he said. Mrs. Donnelly set the tray on a crate. "Then today the town buys the rest." By noon, Mercy Tide had become a community project. Old peeling paint was scraped away in curls. Windows were resealed. Colin replaced 2 rotten deck boards while criticizing every screw previously installed since Confederation. Teenagers sanded rails. A retired electrician rewired the cabin light and charged only for the pleasure of saying modern standards had declined. Nathan worked among them, sleeves rolled, hands busy, receiving thanks in the only form he trusted, labor beside labor. Bruno supervised from the bow like a foreman who accepted no nonsense. Children tied a red bandana around his neck. He tolerated it with solemn dignity. Mira Chin arrived mid-afternoon carrying folders thick with statements. Preliminary injunction filed. Asset freeze requested. Provincial media coming tomorrow. North Bay stock fell 11% before lunch. She handed Nathan a paper cup of coffee. Also, 6 former employees called me privately. People become brave when they realize they are not alone. Nathan leaned against the rail, watching sawdust drift in sunlight. How long will it take? Months. Maybe years for final settlements. She glanced around the dock where neighbors hammered, painted, repaired. Healing seems faster. Later, Nathan walked with Bruno to the seawall overlooking the bay. Water moved blue and honest beneath the afternoon light. Far offshore, gulls turned above the place where Gull Rock hid in distance. He thought of Elias Boone and the lonely years his truth had waited under boards, under soil, under tide. "You should have lived to see this," Nathan said softly to the horizon. Bruno pressed his shoulder against Nathan's leg, the old dog's version of prayer. By evening, Mercy Tide no longer looked broken. She looked weathered, which is different. New white paint brightened her hull. Fresh letters on the stern named her clearly again. Someone had polished the brass bell. Someone else had stocked the galley with soup, tea, and dog biscuits. As the sun lowered, townspeople drifted home one by one, leaving waves, tools, and gratitude behind. Nathan stood alone on deck except for Bruno, who climbed to the bow and settled facing west. The harbor water caught fire in orange bands. Church bells rang 6 times across town. From the street came the sound of children shouting, doors closing, life continuing. Nathan rested a hand on the cabin roof and felt the solidness return to old wood. He had come here with $50, a ruined boat, and nowhere left to go. Now he had work waiting, neighbors calling his name, and a dog who had uncovered more than evidence. Some gifts arrived disguised as wreckage. Bruno narrowed his eyes at the sunset, ears lifted to the breeze, as if listening for footsteps only dogs in heaven can hear. Nathan smiled into the light. "Good catch, partner," he said. The old Doberman did not turn around. Certain men, and certain dogs, never need applause. A week later, Port Mason looked less like a town waiting for rescue and more like one remembering how to stand on its own feet. Trucks from Halifax lined Water Street carrying testing equipment, legal boxes, and journalists dressed for weather they had underestimated. Cameras appeared wherever grief had once gone unnoticed. The harbor did not trust them, but it tolerated them. Nathan had learned that attention arrives late and leaves early. Work, however, stayed. He was on the deck of Mercy Tide replacing a handrail when Mira Chin stepped onto the dock waving a folder thick enough to injure a liar. Bruno, stretched in a patch of sunlight near the bow, opened one eye and decided she could approach. "Preliminary ruling," she called. "North Bay assets frozen. Emergency compensation fund approved pending final litigation." Nathan set down the drill. In English, "Money starts moving to families within 10 days. Even the gulls seemed louder after that. Word spread down the pier faster than diesel on water. Doors opened. Men shouted across slips. Someone rang the brass bell mounted on Mercy Tide 3 times, then many more because restraint has never been a maritime specialty. Mrs. Donnelly cried openly while pretending she had flour in her eyes. Colin Fraser hugged no one but shook every hand hard enough to bruise optimism into them. By noon, neighbors gathered beside the fish market where Mira read the official notice from the back of a pickup truck. Temporary relief for laid-off workers. Debt mediation grants for shuttered small businesses. Harbor restoration funds. Independent environmental cleanup to begin immediately. Medical review support for affected families. Each sentence landed like timber on weak foundations, reinforcing what despair had hollowed out. Nathan stood near the crowd's edge with Bruno at his side. He had no desire for podiums. Good deeds become suspicious when over-explained. Yet people kept finding him. Seamus Kerr, the retired captain, gripped Nathan's forearm and said, "My daughter can keep her house now." The bakery owner handed him a pie still warm enough to fog the tin. A teenager asked if Mercy Tide needed summer deckhands. Gratitude, Nathan noticed, often arrives disguised as practical questions. Provincial officers continued their work in the background. Boxes left the old municipal office. Records were copied. Phones rang unanswered in expensive places. Martin Hale had resigned before sunrise. The black sport utility vehicle had not returned. Power hates daylight once curtains are opened. That afternoon, Nathan walked with Bruno to the shoreline beyond the breakwater where crews in orange jackets sampled water from the bay. Children skipped stones nearby, each splash sounding like punctuation after a long sentence. Bruno moved slower now. The hard week had asked much from old bones. Nathan matched his pace without comment. Love often looks like reducing speed. They sat on a weathered bench facing the Atlantic. Wind carried the clean scent of tide and pine from distant headlands. "You know," Nathan said, rubbing the dog's graying neck, "most officers spend careers looking for evidence. You found it with your feet." Bruno leaned into the touch, eyes half closed. A little girl approached holding a paper bag. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked shyly. "Mum says heroes need lunch." Inside the bag were 2 sandwiches and a note that read "Thank you for staying." Nathan looked toward the town, then back at the child. "Tell your mum heroes prefer mustard next time." She laughed and ran off to report success. Evening settled clear and blue. Lights blinked on along the harbor one by one. Mersey Tide, tide at slip 7, reflected in calm water beside boats being repaired for the coming season. Nathan climbed aboard with Bruno and found another gift waiting at the cabin door. A brass nameplate engraved Captain Bruno. He laughed aloud, the sound surprising even him. He screwed it beside the entrance while the dog watched with grave approval. Later, under a sky salted with stars, Nathan sat on the bow wrapped in a wool coat. Bruno lay beside him, head on his boots. From town came faint music from the pub, hammering from someone working late, and the ordinary noises of people planning tomorrow again. He thought of Elias Boone, whose truth had crossed 12 years of silence to reach this night. He thought of losing everything, then discovering that sometimes losing only clears room for what matters. Mersey Tide rocked gently beneath them, repaired but still carrying her scars. So did he. Out on the dark water, dawn waited somewhere beyond sight. Bruno sighed in his sleep. Nathan looked over the harbour and whispered into the cold, "We will keep watch." Spring arrived slowly on the Nova Scotia coast, as if even the seasons wanted proof before trusting Port Mason again. Snowbanks thinned into shining gutters. Roofs dripped all afternoon. The bay lost its hard winter color and turned steel blue by morning, green by evening, depending on the mercy of the light. With warmer days came more news. Provincial investigators expanded charges. Former North Bay executives hired costly lawyers and discovered that expensive words do not dissolve ledgers. Additional settlements were approved for families whose incomes had collapsed during the closures. The cleanup crews widened their work along the shoreline. For the first time in years, children were told they might soon gather shells without being warned what touched them first. Nathan followed most of this from the deck of Mersey Tide with a mug in hand and Bruno beside him like a silent committee. He had become, against his preference, something of a local symbol. Journalists asked for interviews. He declined politely. Counselors invited him to advisory boards. He declined more politely. A developer from Halifax offered to buy Mersey Tide and turn her into a tourist attraction called the Justice Boat. Nathan laughed long enough that the man mistook it for negotiation. "Not for sale," he said. "Neither is the dog." Life settled into cleaner rhythms. At dawn Nathan helped repair traps, paint hulls, and haul lumber for neighbors whose backs had earned lighter duties. In the afternoons he volunteered with harbor restoration crews, cataloging old dumping sites and mapping damaged beds with the neat precision of a former officer who still preferred order. At night he returned to the cabin, cooked simple meals, and listened to Bruno snore like a distant outboard motor. Peace often sounds less poetic than expected. One bright Saturday, Mira Chen arrived carrying a bakery box and wearing the rare smile of someone who had billed justice properly. "Final court order in principle," she announced. "Compensation trust approved. Long-term environmental monitoring funded. Scholarship program for local youth established from seized assets." Nathan accepted a pastry. "You always bring good news wrapped in sugar." "Only when there is enough of it." She sat beside him on the bow while Bruno inspected the box for legal weaknesses. "There is also a personal award recommended for you," she added. "Substantial sum. Recognition for whistleblower action and assistance." Nathan looked across the harbor where 3 teenagers were repainting an old trawler named Maggie Rose. "Can it be redirected?" Mira studied him. "To what?" "Trade school bursaries. Boat repair apprenticeships. Mental health support for laid-off families. Choose whatever helps people stay." She shook her head softly. "You are inconveniently difficult to market." "Good." Bruno succeeded in obtaining half a pastry through patience rather than force. Some skills improve with age. Later that week, Port Mason held its first harbor festival in nearly a decade. There were fiddle tunes in the square, chowder steaming in paper cups, children with painted faces, and old men insisting every season before this one had larger fish and better weather. Mersey Tide was asked to lead the ceremonial flotilla through the inner harbor. Nathan resisted until Mrs. Donnelly informed him democracy had spoken and she was democracy. So he polished the brass bell, checked the lines, and helped Bruno into his red bandana. As they motored out at idle speed, cheers rose from both docks. Boats followed behind in a ragged proud line, lobster boats, skiffs, runabouts, one kayak whose owner valued enthusiasm over common sense. Bruno stood at the bow, chest forward, ears high, receiving applause with solemn restraint. Nathan, hands on the wheel, felt something loosen inside him that had been tight for years. Not pain exactly. The habit of carrying it. Near the harbor mouth he cut the engine and let the boats drift together under sunlight. Water lapped softly against hulls. Gulls circled overhead like impatient spectators. Nathan rang the bell once for Elias Boone. Then once more for everyone who had nearly forgotten their worth. Hats came off. Heads bowed. Even children sensed the shape of the moment and fell quiet. Bruno looked out toward the open Atlantic where Gull Rock lay somewhere beyond sight, then back toward town, as if measuring how far one hidden truth had traveled. That night, after music faded and lanterns dimmed, Nathan sat on the cabin step while harbor lights shimmered across black water. Bruno leaned against his knee, warm and heavy. "Funny thing," Nathan murmured. "I bought a wreck because I had nowhere else to go." The old Doberman sighed and closed his eyes. Mercy tide rocked gently beneath them, repaired wood carrying repaired lives. Some men chase fortune across oceans. Others find home tied to a dock they almost passed by. Summer settled over Port Mason in long bright evenings and mornings that smelled of tide, spruce, and fresh paint. The harbor no longer woke reluctantly. Engines started before sunrise. Doors opened early. Orders were placed. Nets were mended because they were needed, not because men were trying to remember how. New signs appeared on shops that had once gone dark. The bakery reopened 6 days a week. A marine repair shed hired 2 apprentices funded by the Scholarship Trust. Even the pub replaced its broken jukebox, though some argued silence had better taste. Nathan watched much of it from Mercy Tide, where routine had become its own reward. He rose at dawn, brewed tea, checked lines, and walked Bruno along the seawall before the sun warmed the planks. The old Doberman moved slower now, hip stiff on colder mornings, but pride still carried him straight. Children greeted him by rank rather than name. "Morning, Captain Bruno." He accepted tribute in the form of biscuits and admiration. Nathan had grown used to people stopping by with small reasons that were really larger ones. A deckhand needed advice about discipline. A widower wanted help fixing a leaking door. A teenager asked how to apply to the Coast Guard. A young mother simply wanted to say her husband had found work again and laughed at supper for the first time in 2 years. Nathan gave what he could, mostly tools, time, and the courtesy of listening fully. People heal faster when someone does not interrupt their pain. One afternoon Mirachin arrived carrying a file and a fishing rod. "Which is more alarming?" Nathan asked. "The file means final settlements begin next week," she said. "The rod means I am taking 1 hour off." They walked to the end of Pier 3 while Bruno supervised from a patch of shade. Mira cast badly, admitted it, and cast again. "You realize," she said, "you could leave now. Buy a house inland. Start over somewhere tidy." Nathan watched sunlight break on the bay in 1,000 brief coins. "This place is starting over too." She nodded as if she had expected that answer and merely wanted to hear it aloud. Later that month, a memorial stone for Elias Boone was placed near the harbor entrance. Not large. Good granite does not need to boast. It read, "He kept the truth when others would not." The town gathered beneath clear skies and a wind soft enough to carry voices kindly. Seamus Kerr told stories of Boone's stubbornness. Mrs. Donnelly cried through all of them. Colin Fraser claimed tears were sea spray though the ocean was 30 meters away. Nathan was asked to speak and tried refusing until democracy, again represented by Mrs. Donnelly, overruled him. He stepped to the stone with Bruno beside him. Some people save towns loudly, Nathan said. Others do it by writing things down and trusting someone decent might one day listen. He rested a hand on the granite. We were late. But we came. Nothing more was needed. Silence handled the rest. In August, Mercy Tide made short harbor tours for visitors, with proceeds going to cleanup funds and youth bursaries. Nathan never charged personally. He only steered, told weather stories, and corrected tourists who thought gulls were charming. Bruno stood at the bow for every trip, bandana bright, receiving photographs with stoic patience. If offered tips, Nathan directed them to the donation jar labeled Bruno's retirement plan. It always filled. Yet age writes gently and steadily. One evening after the last tour, Bruno hesitated at the gangplank. Nathan crouched beside him and waited without fuss. After a moment the dog climbed aboard one careful step at a time. Inside the cabin he curled near the bunk sooner than usual and slept deeply through supper. Nathan sat beside him in the dim light, one hand resting on the broad ribs that still rose and fell with faithful rhythm. Outside, laughter drifted. From the dock. Water touched the hull in soft repetitions. You do not owe anyone another miracle, Nathan whispered. Bruno opened one eye, as if to disagree, then closed it again. At dawn the next morning, Port Mason woke to fog rolling low and silver through the slips. Nathan carried a blanket to the bow and found Bruno already there, sitting upright, facing the horizon where sea met sky and neither admitted the line. The old dog's ears lifted to something distant and kind. Nathan stood beside him in silence. Some companions speak all their best words without ever needing a voice. Autumn came early that year, painting the hills above Port Mason with rust, amber, and the deep red of maples that seemed to burn without heat. Morning air carried a sharper edge now. Breath showed white above the docks, and the gulls sounded farther away, as if even they respected the season's quiet. Nathan noticed Bruno rising more slowly each day. The old Doberman still insisted on making the dawn rounds of the harbor, but where he once strode with command, he now walked with deliberation. Pride remained untouched. Only pace had changed. Nathan matched it without comment. Love often sounds like silence and looks like shorter steps. Mercy Tide had become part of the town's rhythm. Schoolchildren waved when they passed. Visitors asked for photographs with the brass plate marked Captain Bruno beside the cabin door. Fishermen touched the rail before long trips the way some men touched church doors. Nathan kept the boat neat, useful, and unremarkable in every way except what she meant. On cool afternoons he ran short harbor tours only when Bruno chose to come. If the dog stayed sleeping in the cabin, Nathan stayed ashore with him. Some schedules outrank money. One windy Tuesday, Mira Chin arrived carrying groceries and a stern expression meant to hide concern. She found Nathan on the dock brushing Bruno's coat while the dog sat facing the sun like an aging king granting audience. He should see Dr. Patel, she said. Nathan kept brushing. He hates clinics. Most honest creatures do. She crouched and let Bruno sniff her hand. So do lawyers, for that matter. The veterinarian's office stood beside the pharmacy in a small blue building that smelled of antiseptic, cedar shavings, and patience. Dr. Arun Patel examined Bruno gently, hands practiced and kind. He listened. To the chest, checked the joints, watched the eyes, then sat back on the rolling stool with the careful face of a man who respected truth enough to deliver it softly. He is old, he said. His heart is tired. His hips are painful. There are medicines for comfort, but time does not negotiate. Nathan nodded once. Men who have worn uniforms learn to receive hard facts standing still. How long? Dr. Patel glanced at Bruno, who was studying a biscuit jar with focused hope. Days can surprise us. Months can too. But I would spend less time counting and more time sharing. On the walk back to the harbor, leaves skittered across the pavement like small fleeing animals. Nathan stopped at the bakery and bought Bruno a plain donut, which the dog accepted as if this had always been standard medical treatment. That evening, the town seemed to know without being told. Colin delivered fresh straw for warmer bedding in the cabin. Mrs. Donnelly brought chicken stew and pretended it was extra. Seamus Kerr left a wool blanket folded by the gangplank with no note at all. Children drew pictures of Bruno wearing a captain's hat and slid them under the door. Port Mason had learned gratitude and was eager to practice. Nathan spent the next weeks differently. He turned down interviews, meetings, and invitations that would have mattered once. Instead he sat on the bow with Bruno in afternoon sun. He hand-fed him bits of salmon. He spoke aloud memories no one else had asked for, academy days, mistakes made, the loneliness after losing the badge, the night claws struck old floorboards and changed everything. Bruno listened the way only dogs can, without impatience or the need to reply. Some confessions need no absolution, only witness. One dawn after heavy rain, Nathan woke to unusual quiet. No collar shake. No careful pause on the deck. He found Bruno already at the bow, seated upright beneath a blanket, looking toward the harbor mouth where mist rolled silver over calm water. The old dog did not turn when Nathan approached, but his tail moved once against the wood. Nathan sat beside him and wrapped an arm around the broad shoulders that had grown thinner under the coat. Together they watched fishing boats depart in lines of white wake. Church bells rang 7 times across town. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a hammer struck metal in steady rhythm. Life continued all around them, not careless, simply faithful to its own motion. Bruno leaned gently against Nathan's side and rested there. Nathan felt the slow heartbeat under his palm, measured and precious. "You can rest when you need to," he whispered into the cold morning. "No one here will forget who kept watch." The wind moved over the water and through the mast lines with a sound like distant singing. Bruno closed his eyes but kept his face turned toward the light. The first frost came overnight and silvered every rope, railing, and rooftop in Port Mason. Dawn rose clear and pale, the kind of cold Canadian morning that makes sound travel farther and breath seem visible enough to count. Nathan woke before the bells and knew at once the cabin was too still. No slow shifting on the floorboards. No collar tag brushing wood. Only the quiet hum of the heater and the faint lap of water against the hull. He sat up carefully and saw Bruno already at the bow where he had gone sometime before sunrise. The old Doberman lay on the blanket Nathan had tucked around him the day before, body relaxed, muzzle resting between his paws, face turned toward the harbor mouth where the sea opened to the wider world. Nathan crossed the deck without hurry. Some moments deserve gentleness more than speed. He knelt beside his friend and placed a hand on the broad chest that had once stood between fear and countless ordinary days. There was no breath now. No struggle. Only peace so complete it felt almost luminous in the cold air. Nathan bowed his head and rested his forehead against Bruno's neck. The fur still held a trace of warmth. "Fair winds, Captain," he whispered. "You kept watch long enough." Church bells rang 7 times across town. The sound drifted over the water and through the masts like a blessing arriving on schedule. By 8 o'clock, people began to gather without being called. Colin Fraser came first carrying coffee for 2 out of habit and set 1 cup quietly on the dock rail. Mrs. Donnelly arrived with tears she did not bother hiding. Seamus Kerr removed his cap and held it against his chest. Children came clutching drawings of Bruno in his bandana and captain's plate. Mira Chen stood near the gangplank in a dark coat, saying nothing because wisdom often knows when words would only take space from grief. News moved through Port Mason the way tide moves through grass marshes, silent, certain, touching everything. By mid-morning the whole harbor seemed hushed. Engines started softer. Voices dropped lower. Even gulls circled wide as if respecting ceremony. Nathan wrapped Bruno in the wool blanket Seamus had given weeks earlier. He fastened the red bandana neatly at the old dog's neck and carried him down the gangplank himself. No one offered help. Some burdens belonged to one pair of arms. They walked together to the memorial stone of Elias Boone near the harbour entrance, where sunlight struck the granite clean and bright. There, beside the man whose truth Bruno had uncovered, the town had prepared a place overlooking the water. Dr. Patel stood nearby with kind eyes and reddened nose from the cold. Children laid spruce boughs and late autumn flowers. Someone placed the brass plate reading Captain Bruno at the foot of the stone. Nathan set Bruno down gently on the blanket and knelt beside him one last time. He was only a dog, he said quietly, voice carrying farther than he intended. A few people smiled through tears, knowing better. But he found what many men missed. He guarded what mattered. He reminded a tired town that loyalty still existed. He looked over the gathered faces, then toward the bay beyond. And he made one man less alone. They buried Bruno there with the harbour in view and the sea wind moving over the hill. No grand speeches followed. Only silence, hats removed, heads bowed, the kind of silence earned by love honestly lived. Winter deepened in the weeks after, yet Port Mason kept moving. Cases were won. Funds arrived. Boats launched. Apprentices learned trades. Families stayed. Mercy Tide remained at slip 7, painted white against dark water, cabin lamp glowing each evening. Nathan still lived aboard her, though he could have left 100 times by then. Some mornings he stood at the bow with tea in hand and spoke aloud to no one visible. Some evenings he set 2 biscuits on the cabin shelf before remembering and smiling at himself. Grief does not vanish. It learns the harbour. Then one spring dawn, months later, the first boats of the season motored out beneath a pink sky. Nathan stepped onto deck and looked toward the memorial hill where sunlight touched the stone and brass plate together. A breeze moved across the bow, warm for the hour, carrying the faint scent of cedar and dog fir memory. He laughed softly. Late for rounds again. The harbour glowed gold. Mercy Tide rocked beneath him, steady and repaired. Nathan took the wheel as the town woke behind him. Somewhere beyond sight, where faithful things go when their watch is done, he imagined an old Doberman standing tall at the edge of morning, still facing the light.